Hattie, Chest College Humanities. Two, how you doing? You all have a big day for your families, Thanksgiving Day. This will be the only lecture this week. I did assign a new paper yesterday, so please look at that. Another essay, essay 8, I think. That'll be the last one of the course on popular music. I gave you a choice between bands in the 60s, 70s, 80s, 90s, and current. I think I did. Um, or maybe I stopped in the 90s. Whatever, pick one of those bands or musicians. Or if you want to write about something else, write about it, but you have to tell me what it is. But just don't write about your favorite musician. If Taylor Swift is your go-to, I'd rather you write about something you really don't know that much about. And even if you're not a fan of it, that's how you learn things. Anyway, try to pick something from that list. But if you don't want to pick something from that list, you have to run by what you want to write about. I'll let you have that leeway. Okay, so we have to get through this current state of music in this country, and I am staying essentially in American Western music. We're not going to South America or Africa or Asia. I wish we had time for that, but we don't. Um, some of this stuff does leak over to England because so much of our music, like the Beatles and the Rolling Stones and the rest, came from England. So that's really important to know. But anyway, in the 60s, we have the band that changed the entire face of the cultures throughout the world, not just in the United States. The Beatles, whether you like them or not, they did. Nobody had ever seen anything like it or heard anything like it. That's how revolutionary it was. Yes, their appearance was revolution. Their music was a revolution, and we're still looking at it all these years. There's a new documentary coming out that I'm looking forward to. I think it's on Disney Plus. 6 hours. Peter Jackson, the guy who did Lord of the Rings, has spent the last 3 years going through material of the Beatles' last recording sessions. Last that was that the album that came out of that was Let It Be. The sessions were called Get Back. The Beatles. It was Paul's idea to. The Beatles had gotten so big in their music, they could not be duplicated on stage. Now they can with fancy keyboards and sequencers and all that. Yes, you can recreate all that orchestration on a keyboard. They couldn't in those days without actually bringing the orchestra along. And they had stopped performing live by then anyway. So they had gotten very extravagant with beginning with essentially Sergeant Pepper's and Magical Mystery Tour and a few others. And the music, even though it was considered wonderful, not my favorite Beatles songs, by the way. I like them more when they're stripped down. Not all the fuss. Um, they couldn't duplicate those songs in a million years in those days with the technology, and so now they can. But so this movie is it's going to be a revelation. They're showing previews all over YouTube. Maybe you've looked at them, maybe not. The lads are young and very thin. They're also thin and young, and it's hard to picture them that way because they're all would be 80. Most of them would be 80 now, but they're only in their 20s in this thing, recorded in 1969. Um, 52 years ago. So John was about 27, 26, Paul about 25. George was about 23 years old. So they're young lads producing some of the most revolutionary music that we're still trying to come to terms with. People never stop analyzing the Beatles. Yes, there was other British invasion bands. Obviously, the Rolling Stones and the lesser bands like My Beloved Kinks, The Who, the great Pete Townshend's Who, uh, then lighter weight bands like Herman's Hermits, Dave Clark Five, all wonderful British invasion movies. Movies, I should say. They did make movies too. Coming out of this little UK country, and they took our country by storm. And so the 60s really belonged so much to the English. Later on in the late 60s, we had Jimi Hendrix, who was an American, but he had to go to England to get famous. Um, and then we had bands that came up out of England a little later than the Beatles. And in the 70s, they creeped in like Black Sabbath and Led Zeppelin. And David Bowie, who essentially, along with Mark Bolan and a few others, created this genre of music called glam rock. They dressed it up. They were androgynous. You know what that means, folks? They appealed to both male and female. What were they, male or female? Well, they played it to the hilt, especially Bowie, and became not just a fashion icon. His music was iconic because what was he singing about? He was singing about transgressive, transgendered things way before it was in our lexicon or kind of where we are now with that in our culture. Bowie was dressing it up. Yes, he appealed to both male and female because the men liked him because he was very androgynously female, but women like it too. Women like guys, I'm not kidding, women, be truthful, who dress in glam. I mean, all you have to do is look at Mark Bolan and if you know who that is, T Rex, they're doing it now. Harry Styles does that, right? Sometimes he's in a dress, he's got makeup on. What's he doing? What's he up to? Lady Gaga plays around with that. Madonna plays around with it. So it's always fluid. So because we're complicated, we're we're complicated people. We have more than one thing in us. Maybe not. Maybe you only have the one thing. That's fine. But can you accept someone else's thing? Um, that's why, to me, so many musical genres like country music seems like they have a single message of kind of drinking beer and driving trucks and not mistreating your dog. Whereas pop music that's complicated, like David Bowie, um, paints a more complicated picture of the human experience in this world we live in. And so the 70s was full of that. Yes, the 70s also gave us, one of the greatest rock bands in history. Bands, Led Zeppelin, obviously, and they weren't, I wouldn't say they were androgynous. Jimmy Page had a beauty to him that men and women were attracted to. Robert Plant, same way. I was always performing without his shirt on. What's up with that, folks? Um, but they were considered excessive in their lifestyle, sex, drugs, and rock and roll. Yep, to the hilt. And then here comes disco. Oh, God, the dreaded disco. Obviously, the Bee Gees is the most obvious, famous one, and they wrote some decent songs. I'm not taking anything away from it. Donna Summers, Casey and the Sunshine Band, to me, it was abomination music. I was an anti-disco guy. I still am. I appreciate the nostalgia of it. And I like the movie Saturday Night Fever. Really an excellent movie. Bee Gees did a great job on the soundtrack, but for the love of God, don't make me listen to it. And then all of a sudden, my beloved punk rock reared its head in protest of all these, of disco and of what they call progressive rock, prog rock, which would be Emerson, Lake and Palmer, Pink Floyd. Um, yes, the musicians were excellent musicians. They're way above most people's talent, and they couldn't keep up with it. And all of a sudden, to be in a band, you had to be a virtuoso on guitar, bass, drums, keyboards, whatever. And most people aren't, folks. And so here comes punk. You could give punk credit to, I would say, the Ramones. Someone might say the Sex Pistols. That's in England, but that was a couple year later. But the other bands were starting the punk feel, which was simple songs played with simple chords, a lot of aggression, a lot of rage because they were pissed off, folks. They're usually people that weren't being listened to. They didn't have a voice, and the music gave them a voice. And it became bigger than disco. Maybe it never sold and it didn't sell like disco, but it became more meaningful because it actually had a meaning besides just having a good time and dancing the night away. Um, the 70s were highly important to rock and roll music, especially the late 70s, and even groups like Led Zeppelin and Pink Floyd had to acknowledge that they had gotten kind of bloated, too big to ride around in private jets. They had lost kind of contact and touch with the common person, and punk kind of brought them back. Everybody was affected by punk, even John Lennon before he died. Um, and then in America, we had all the CBGB bands in New York. Maybe you've been to New York. Hopefully you have. Maybe you're walking by. It's no longer what it used to be. I think something else is in there now, but it was in the Bowery. If you know where I'm talking about, you know what I'm talking about. It was a little tiny nightclub that was performing country and western music, and somebody from a band you would never probably hear of called Television asked if they could play like a Monday night or Tuesday night, and the guy goes, "I'll give you a chance." Hillary, the owner, and he gave him a chance. He saw that there was people showing up. He was selling some booze. Then he said, "Okay, I'll give you more chances." And then other people started going down to CBGB that were living in New York at this time. And I would say the bands that you might have heard of called Blondie, with Deborah Harry, the Talking Heads with David Byrne, they started getting gigs at CBGB and developing an audience, along with the Ramones and a poet who to me is on par, easily on par with Bob Dylan or John Lennon. Her name is Patti Smith, who just turned 75 this week. God bless Patti. I've seen her many times, Patti Smith Band, and they started playing there. And all of a sudden, these bands were starting to get signed to record companies and they were getting to tour outside of New York City. Now, in the beginning, they were not accepted. In the Midwest, they were looked upon like low citizens. They wore black leather jackets and had short hair, and that pissed off the local rednecks as well as should. And but even it started making inroads then in places like Cleveland and Chicago and Pittsburgh and LA and San Francisco all had punk rock scenes. Minneapolis too. Uh, I lived in LA during that time, and we went to many concerts and places that aren't there anymore. Yes, the whiskey's still there, but I'm talking about Club 88, Club Lingerie, The Mask, and Southern California punk was definitely different than New York punk. We had bands like the Germs, Fear, who I was never very, they were too macho for my taste, too male. My favorite band, maybe of all time of that era, still is X with John Doe and Exene. They were writing meaningful poetry, so savage, beautiful beat. And then there are other bands that became very huge. The Go-Go's started off as punk rock folks. You wouldn't know it by their singles, but they were there in the beginning at the Mask, and until someone said you should write a pop song, you're all too cute, and let's get some cute dresses on, and that's what sold them. There's a cute image. Um, but there was other bands there at the time, the Dickies, the Weirdos, all trying to make in an impact on music. Southern California had its own sound. Then Orange County came along with kind of a more testosterone-driven music, like Black Flag, the Minutemen, the Circle Jerks, and they brought in a kind of a different type of audience. We went from what they call doing the pogo dance, which is that jumping up and down dance that new wave punk started, to the mosh pit, which can get really, really violent. That's what Orange County did. The skinheads and the guys with the shaved heads had to get out their aggression with bands like um, Black Flag, etc. And that kind of put the kibosh on that scene because they were closing down a lot of clubs. The police had to close them down because there was too much violence, too much bad behavior. It's a lot of rage out there, folks, and you can get it out in a punk rock band. Get the rage out. That's why that was a beautiful moment that became a bad moment when the violence got too much and the cops shut down everything. And look, there are scenes in San Francisco, the Mumbai High Gardens, and other places in San Francisco when I lived there. They were introducing these bands. Patti Smith played there, Devo, and they were starting to get their own scene there also, like the Dead Kennedys, the Avengers. Um, so these scenes were going on everywhere across the country, not in Middle America, folks. They weren't happening in Arkansas or the Midwest, the Church Belt, the Bible Belt, as they call it. That was still pretty against this type of music. But the brave ones toured there, and they broke people's expectations down. Um, the Sex Pistols from England came over. They didn't tour. They should have. It was a mistake their manager made. They booked them into all these southern redneck clubs, and they played. They didn't play in Chicago and all the places that would have accepted them easily. They played in hard places like Atlanta, Florida, and they were essentially heated. Then they got to San Francisco, Winterland. They only lasted one tour of the Sex Pistols before Johnny Rotten quit. He'd had it. He felt it was too cynical, and or they weren't performing monkeys. And he was trying to do something authentic, and it wasn't happening. Another disappointed artist. It's a familiar refrain. Um, then we got into the '80s, and there was this thing called college rock. Because the reason why I call it that, because they had college radio. A lot of colleges throughout the country had their own radio stations that had a very limited audience, mostly the students that went to that college, and they had their own sort of music. And bands like, probably the most famous one that came out of that was REM, and the lesser ones would be Husker Du and Replacements and others. Started getting a foothold in popular music. They're starting to get radio play other than college radio, but it started there with college students, people who read books, people who were looking for more artistic expression, literally based on all the history that had happened before, from Black Sabbath to Patti Smith to then you have the Replacements, and all based on an authentic music that really stemmed from bands like New York bands like the Velvet Underground, the MC5, the Stooges, and New York Dolls. It was 3 minute, 3 chord rock and roll done with grace and rage and an intelligence behind it. College radio, folks, that means people were actually intelligent. They're getting degrees as they're getting their music fix. And that was hugely popular. As huge as somebody like Michael Jackson? No, absolutely not. Michael Jackson came out with his family in the late 60s. Jackson 5, maybe you love him. Michael Jackson went on to one of the biggest successful solo careers in the history of popular music. Thriller was, you can't deny Thriller. It's the Sgt. Pepper's of the '80s. Um, Michael was a phenomenon. And then he got it. His fall from grace wasn't so nice. His fall from grace, with innuendo of perhaps sleeping with underage kids and dying early. So there's an asterisk on poor Michael's legend, his myth, which he earned, but he fell from grace with the suspicion that perhaps he was perhaps having sexual relationships with kids 12 years old, little boys. Can you still listen to Michael Jackson? Absolutely. That's always going to be there, though. That's a shame. And we'll never know at the end of the day because poor Michael is dead, died way too young, too many drugs in his body, like Elvis. They're on a million prescription meds to get through the day, and the imbalance is so fragile. And now people, this is before fentanyl dust, folks. When Elvis died, he had something like 42 different medications in his body. That'll kill you eventually, and did so with poor Michael. Um, but we still have his music. In the 80s, there was this trend for electronic music, like bands like the Eurythmics, wonderful bands like them, and then uh, keyboards became a big deal. Electric guitars kind of got replaced for a while. Everybody was playing synthesizers, and they were very popular, like the Thompson Twins from England. Most of it coming out of England, but then in this country, we had bands like Devo that were doing the same thing. European centric, based on so many of the European bands, mostly a German band called. Why? I just draw a blank what they're called. Ah, I'll come up with that in a minute. Anyway, they were doing a post punk music, electronically based music that had a driving edge to it, an industrial edge to it. And then bands like Susie's and the Banshees showed up, and The Cure, and they labeled it Goth Rock because it had a dark edge to it, and the kids were dressing in that gothic way with the dyed black hair and black clothes and eyeliner, the boys and the girls. And the music was their kind of a background to their angst that they're going through. And that had a huge influence on who they were. And it all went back to early rock and roll, Chuck Berry and Elvis, and on and on. And then rockabilly became popular for a little bit with places like bands like the Cramps, which had they called it psychobilly. It had kind of punk rock attitude with southern rockabilly. Stray Cats would probably be the most successful of that sort of thing. Maybe you know who they are. They had some pretty big hits in the '80s, folks. I know I'm behind before your time, but maybe your brothers and sisters or aunts and uncles listen to this. You know what I'm talking about, or maybe you're old enough to know. In the '90s, we had hip hop started rearing up from the inner city and the streets, from cities, New York, LA, Pittsburgh, Chicago, and rap music started becoming the signature sound of African American experience in this country, African American rage and their life. And so that became really pivotal during this time. If you look at the assignment, you could write about one of the most legendary hardcore hip hop bands that came out of this era. You can write about them if you choose. I would suggest you listen to their music, maybe watch some documentaries. Don't research and do it all from Wikipedia. Please don't do that. That doesn't say anything to me. I need to see that you kind of know what the hell you're talking about in your essays. And there were other people coming out of the hip hop area that, from Tupac to the Wu Tang Clan and Ice T and Ice Cube and all their bands. A lot of it had a lot of rage in it, and a lot of pain. And then it got to be, and it's offensive to some people who don't like, you know, some of the messages they're getting along, how they treated women, which is not good, folks. Not saying all of it, but some of it was shitty. Um, but it was the truth, and the truth hurts. Always does. It's painful. and we need the truth. Like John Lennon sang, "Give me the truth." It's not easy. Um, and then we had grunge coming out of Seattle. Nirvana would be the the masthead on that one. Soundgarden, Screaming Trees, coming out of the Seattle area. Now it was, and that's based on really, it's based on some heavy metal like Black Sabbath and other bands that came out of that era, AC/DC, and then they put that, they kind of matched it with punk rock, say the Germs and Ramones, and then they kind of mixed it with melodic flavor like the Beatles. Kurt Cobain loved the Beatles, and you could hear it in his music. He has always a melodic tune going through the rage of the guitar and the screaming vocals. Soundgarden the same way. The problem, the tragedy of the Seattle scene, it was a dark scene. It's dark up there, folks. There's not a lot of sunlight, but there's a lot of heroin. And it took a lot of people down. Alice in Chains, for one. He died of an overdose. Many of them died from drug overdoses, of heroin. Their music is, a lot of people consider it our music. I love it because it's what I roll to. Uh, and of course, Kurt was a heroin addict and loved his guns to death, literally. Um, so there's a lot of pain in the grunge scene. It's not happy music, folks, but it is rockin' music, and it's savage in its brutality and its beauty. Then, then the 2000s, things take a turn. Rock bands aren't so much in favor anymore. Look at the Emmys tonight. Is there a rock band in it? I don't think there is. I don't really pay attention much to it, but it's all singers, dancers, dance it away. Kind of Madonna kind of started that whole trend. Actually, Cher started it before her, but where she comes out dancing with a bunch of boy dancers being sexual around her, and that became huge. And that's kind of where we are right now. And so I'm kind of out of the music scene. Yes, I know who these people are. I listened to Taylor Swift's 10-minute song. It's okay. Um, it's hard for me to relate to what a 24-year-old girl thinks about love. Okay, it's her opinion. That's great. But I'm a long way off that. So I'm cynical and jaded, and I'm not so open to it. I'm glad something's popular. But some of the bands like Lady Gaga and Britney Spears, Justin Bieber, Timberlake, Harry Styles, they're all presenting something to the youth of America that they're relating to. And as long as we're listening to something, I'm all for it. And so when we shut it off and don't listen, can you imagine not having music in your life? I can't. And hopefully you can't either. Do a great paper. Enjoy your Thanksgiving day. Be with your family. Be thankful for what you have and keep rocking. See you next time.